once again to the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, this time to the post-World War II years, and I suppose we can say welcome to the Church in the age of patriotism. This will be the period of time, 1945 to 1960, which will take us right to the door of the Second Vatican Council and the tremendous changes that would mean for the Church. One commentator talking about these particular years said that as far as United States Catholics were concerned, this was just another rite in a long series of rites of passage, which is probably true if you consider all that we have been talking about up to this point in the course. It's an optimistic time for the Church in the United States, as we said in our conclusion last time. Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who had been a very popular radio preacher since the 1930s, said that the war that had just been concluded was not simply a struggle between the Allied powers and the Axis powers. It was rather a fight between those who favored democracy and those who were the forces of the Antichrist, to use Sheen's own words. The bishops of the United States issued a pastoral letter shortly after the conclusion of the Second World War, saying that this had been a noble fight in which American Catholics were involved with their fellow compatriots, their fellow citizens, fighting against those forces that would try to deprive mankind of liberty. Well, as we come in now to this age of patriotism, the first point that we want to talk about is in fact, it is a very controversial one. It is the decision of President Harry Truman to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 53.5% of the American people, we are told, approved of Mr. Truman's decision. Most American bishops were silent. Most American Catholic periodicals were silent. But Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement did make an interesting comment. Very, very much opposed to President Truman's decision, Dorothy Day said, "We have created destruction." And in a very rare moment of agreement, Commonweal magazine found itself in agreement with Pat Scanlon at the Brooklyn Tablet, as both of them were very critical of Mr. Truman's decision. On a much brighter note, following World War II, we would want to mention the passage of the so-called Servicemen's Readjustment Act. More properly, more affectionately put, that was the GI Bill. 7.5 million Americans went to college because of that piece of legislation. And it certainly was one piece of legislation that changed, in many ways, the United States Catholic scene. Catholic lay people began attending universities in tremendous numbers because of this bill, and we really became a more educated religious group in the United States. Catholic writing was becoming stronger. You had marvelous authors like Fulton Ausler, who gave us the books, the Greatest Faith Ever Known, The Greatest Story Ever Told. People like Fulton Ausler and Thomas Merton were creating great Catholic literature. Monsignor Matthew Smith in Denver, Colorado, began the registered chain of Catholic weeklies with a phenomenal subscription rate all over the country. This, of course, was the forerunner to what we know today as the National Catholic Register. Our Sunday Visitor, which was now just a few decades old, was increasing its circulation, and it was being led by the very capable John Francis Noel, the Bishop of Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Brooklyn Tablet, which we previously mentioned, under the able leadership of Pat Scanlon. The Wanderer, which was begun by the Matt family in St. Paul, Minnesota, was increasing its circulation. The Wanderer was not the paper that we know today. The Wanderer began as a German-speaking weekly for German Catholics in the Midwest. Theological journals were starting to emerge in the early 50s, publications such as Integrity, Cross Currents, and Jubilee. You also had, in this country, certainly by the 50s, and even earlier for that matter, the publishing house, the Catholic publishing house of Sheed and Ward. That was, of course, the very famous Catholic apologist and writer Frank Sheed, in company with his wife Maisie Ward of a distinguished English Catholic family. Sheed and Ward had begun on Maiden Lane in London in 1926. They opened their office on Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1933. By the 1950s, they were producing tremendous amounts of Catholic literature. Catholic authors from all over the world were being published because of the marvelous work of Sheed and Ward in London and in New York. If there was one Catholic leader in the late 40s and early 50s who was best known of them all, that Catholic leader most certainly would have been a man named Francis J. Spellman. Francis J. Spellman was a priest of the Boston Archdiocese who had studied in Rome, came back to work in Boston, and went back to Rome again to work as an attaché in the Vatican Secretariat of State in 1925. When Vatican Radio went on the air in 1932, young Father Spellman was one of the earliest announcers. And as he was working in Rome, Father Spellman made many close and long-enduring friendships. One of the strongest friendships he made was with a man by the name of Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. The two men became fast friends in these early years, and as we know very well, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli was eventually elected Pope Pius XII. But prior to that, when Cardinal Pacelli came to the United States, it was really at the invitation of his friend Francis J. Spellman, and he came here, and Spellman made sure that Cardinal Pacelli had a very lengthy meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Well, in 1939, Cardinal Pacelli was elected the pontiff, Pope Pius XII, and before that year had concluded, his friend Spellman became the 6th Archbishop of New York and the military vicar of the armed forces. And in this position especially, military vicar of the armed forces, Cardinal Spellman was known to Americans of all creeds from 1939 until his death in the fall of 1967. He maintained a friendship with Presidents Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. He was even known to give the presidents advice, particularly in areas of foreign policy. Cardinal Spellman was one of the leading foes of communism in the United States. He began opposing it back in the 40s, and he continued opposing it through the 50s. He became a friend of Senator Joe McCarthy, and even in the late 60s, very shortly before his death, he became very, very anti-communist once again in his rhetoric as he strongly defended United States policy in Southeast Asia, and he condemned communist tactics in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, and in any other part of the world where you found communist intrusions. Cardinal Spellman, as the military vicar, became very famous for his Christmas visits to United States servicemen overseas. That began during the Korean conflict. It continued for many years thereafter, and it was still going on while the United States was involved in the Vietnam conflict in the 1960s. Every Christmas Eve, Cardinal Spellman would leave New York City and would fly to a distant part of the world for spiritual ministration to our troops serving in so many, many different places around the world. His travels took him hundreds of thousands of miles, and he became, as we say, unusually well known throughout the world. Cardinal Spellman was himself quite a recognized author. He wrote over a dozen books in his career, and among them were Action This Day, which recounts a number of his military journeys, Prayers and Poems, The Foundling, which was a novel, very well circulated, and a book called What America Means to Me. Cardinal Spellman, certainly one of the greats, one of the towering figures in American Catholicism in the 40s, in the 50s, and really right up until his death in 1967. There were other national figures, of course, beginning in the 1940s and continuing on. The Church of Chicago had a very cultivated leader in the person of Cardinal Samuel A. Stritch. Cardinal Stritch would ultimately die in Rome, where he had gone to take up an appointment as head of the Vatican's Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Richard J. Cushing came to the See of Boston in 1944, and for over a quarter century, Cardinal Cushing built an unsurpassed reputation for charity. It was Cardinal Cushing who began the Missionary Society of St. James the Apostle, a society in which diocesan priests could give a certain amount of their time, usually a few years, and they would go in missionary service to Latin America. That whole idea was the brainchild of Boston's Cardinal Cushing. Cardinal Edward Mooney of Detroit would die in 1958 after 21 rather eventful years as the Archbishop of Detroit. Cardinal Joseph Elmer Ritter had come to St. Louis back in 1946. Cardinal Ritter was described as an outspoken progressive, one who pioneered school desegregation. In Philadelphia, beginning in 1951, you had a Holy Cross Father coming there as the Archbishop, Father John O'Hara. Father O'Hara had been the president of Notre Dame University before he became the Archbishop of New York. His heart was very much in academics. He probably would have preferred to remain a professor at the University of Notre Dame, but he answered the call of the Holy See, and he went to Philadelphia as its archbishop. Cardinal O'Hara was a very interesting man in many ways. He was an economic and a political conservative, came from a staunch Republican family in the state of Indiana, and interestingly, when the Catholic layman William F. Buckley Jr. was beginning his very prestigious conservative intellectual journal, National Review, it was Cardinal John O'Hara who was one of the generous financial contributors for the initial venture that Mr. Buckley was trying and indeed successfully did get started. Baltimore was a diocese which somewhat eclipsed in importance following the death of Cardinal Gibbons in 1921. Gibbons was succeeded by a man by the name of Michael Curley, who became not only the Archbishop of Baltimore, but also the Archbishop of Washington. And upon Curley's death in 1947, his successor, Francis Keogh, became only the Archbishop of Baltimore. In that year, the two sees were divided, and a New York priest named Patrick Aloysius O'Boyle became the first Archbishop of Washington. Cardinal O'Boyle had been the director of the National Catholic Welfare Council's War Relief Services during the Second World War, and so therefore he had a very considerable background and was a very knowledgeable man when he came to the nation's capital to become its first archbishop. As we are progressing now in the decade of the 1950s, the mid and late 50s, once again we see a story that we've seen so many times in this survey course, the phenomenal growth of the Catholic population in the United States. By the mid to late 1950s, the Catholic population in America had reached 43 million people. Imagine, 43 million. We were strong, we were articulate, we could express our views, we could certainly stand up for what we believed in. And one of the things we believed in, and one of the things we were going to become very articulate about in the 1950s, was the issue of communism. The great international threat that communism was, really from its foundation after the Russian Revolution in 1917, right until its demise in our own day. Well, communism was very much the issue of the 1950s, and we did produce some very outspoken Catholic critics of the whole concept of communism. One of them was a man whom we have mentioned many times, Fulton J. Sheen. In the 1930s, as a young professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America, Monsignor Sheen had begun doing radio broadcasts for the National Council of Catholic Men on their program, which we've already mentioned, called the Catholic Hour. Millions and millions of Americans listened to Monsignor Sheen on the radio. Just as many, I suppose, read the wonderful books of Monsignor Sheen, books like The Life of Christ, Peace of Soul, Lift Up Your Heart, and especially Communism and the Conscience of the West. Sheen began to be one of the most articulate spokesmen fighting communism, international communism in particular. In 1951, he was made Auxiliary Bishop of New York and National Director for the Society of the Propagation of the Faith. He moved rather quickly from radio to television, where he began a series that aired in the 1950s and was brought back again in the 1960s. So many of us remember that series so affectionately. It was called Life is Worth Living. And it was probably one of the most popular television series running in those days. Well, in Life is Worth Living, Bishop Sheen really took on communism. He talked very positively about the values of American society. He talked very positively about what the founding fathers of this country had done to and had given us in those magnificent documents produced in Philadelphia. And then he gave this quote. This is typical of what he said in many of his television broadcasts. He was talking about the citizens of the Soviet Republic, and he said that the citizens of the Soviet Republic were, at least on paper, given freedom of worship, but freedom of propaganda belonged, he said, to the Soviet state. Now, says Sheen, notice the distinction that the communists have made between worship and propaganda. May you worship? Yes, if you can find a church to worship in after they've destroyed 53,000 of them. But may you build new churches? May you instruct youth. May you educate. May you publish religious documents. May you unite young men and women in clubs and organizations. May you have any printing presses? No. Why not? Because that's propaganda. And freedom of propaganda, and he especially notes here freedom of anti-religious propaganda, was reserved to the state. In other words, said Bishop Sheen, yes, you may worship, but you may lose your job if you do. But all anti-religious propaganda belongs only to the state. Now, what is fearful, said Bishop Sheen, what is fearful is that we may eventually say, as we are indeed beginning to say, that no prayer and no God will ultimately be the prerogative of the state. Now, that's a quote from one of the television broadcasts of Sheen. You have to realize that this man had not only a tremendous intellect, but he also had a very, very forceful television personality. So he was combining his great intellect with that forceful television personality that so many of us remember. That's what made Sheen such an effective anti-communist spokesman back in the 1950s. Sheen, of course, was not the only crusader and speaker in those days. The Knights of Columbus joined the crusade. The Catholic War veterans joined the crusade. And in a period of less than 1 year, Catholics in the Archdiocese of New York raised $4 million to build Archbishop Stepinac High School in White Plains. Archbishop Stepinac, of course, was that wonderful Croatian archbishop who was imprisoned in Tito's Yugoslavia on charges of wartime collaboration with the Axis powers. Cardinal Spellman went even further in his own anti-communist crusade. He encouraged mass rallies on behalf of the persecuted Christians living behind the Iron Curtain. And these mass rallies would be held on the campus of Fordham University in the Bronx in New York. They attracted thousands of people, and it would have been quite a remarkable sight to see thousands of people gather there on Edwards Parade in front of Keating Hall at Fordham University, and in unison reciting the rosary for all of those people who were living behind the Iron Curtain. A man by the name of Louis Boudens became very popular on the lecture circuit. Boudens had been a Catholic. He had fallen away from the church. He had been the editor of the Communist Daily Worker here in the United States for a good number of years. Then he was reconciled to the church by Monsignor Fulton Sheen, and he became a leading spokesman on the anti-Catholic circuit, a very, very strong crusader. Probably the best known, the best remembered of them all was the United States Senator from the state of Wisconsin, a Roman Catholic by the name of Joseph Raymond McCarthy. In February of 1950, Joe McCarthy went to Wheeling, West Virginia, and he gave a speech to the Wheeling Republican Women's Club. In this particular speech, which really put McCarthy on the map and gave him a tremendous national following and notoriety, he charged that the State Department was infiltrated with communists and their dupes. In fact, he said there were 205 of them that he knew of working in the State Department. McCarthy came right out and called these people traitors, and he said that these traitors were, and we quote him, bright young men who were born with silver spoons in their mouths, favored with the finest homes, the finest college educations, and the finest jobs that the government could give. And for the next 5 years after that talk, McCarthy was relentless in his pursuit of communists in the State Department, communists in any form of government, any area of government where he could find them. Not only communists, but for that matter, anyone whom Joe McCarthy deemed to be subversive. Catholic reaction to Joe McCarthy is something which interests us very much in this historical look at the church. Many people in the church strongly favored Senator McCarthy. Many people did not favor him. The auxiliary bishop of Chicago, a man named Bernard Shiel, said that McCarthy's style was, quotes, a monstrous perversion of morality to justify lies, calumny, and the absence of charity, and calculated deceit in the name of anti-communism. In the South and in the West, Catholic reaction was somewhat mild, but in the far West, Catholic reaction was very, very favorable. In Cardinal McIntyre's Archdiocese of Los Angeles, his paper, The Tidings, gave a very strong pro-McCarthy editorial position. Cardinal Spellman in New York seemed not to take any particular position vocally about McCarthy, but they were known to be friends. And one time, Cardinal Spellman came to a New York City Police Department communion breakfast, and his presence at that communion breakfast where Joe McCarthy was speaking seemed to indicate his favorable, his friendly attitude to Senator McCarthy. McCarthy could count on good press from Our Sunday Visitor. He could count on good press from Pat Scanlon at the Brooklyn Tablet, Father Gillis at the Catholic World, Notre Dame's famous magazine Ave Maria, all very strongly in favor of the crusade of Senator Joe McCarthy. The Jesuit New York-based publication America, however, was a publication that was very anti-McCarthy. In fact, they became so strong, the editors, Jesuit editors, became so strongly anti-McCarthy that some of their Jesuit superiors insisted that they tone down their rhetoric. So Joe McCarthy now was one of these men who really evoked very strong emotions one way or another. It was awfully hard to maintain neutrality as far as Joe McCarthy was concerned. He roused the passions of people one way or another. It seemed you either loved McCarthy or you hated McCarthy. Nonetheless, he was indeed a Roman Catholic and a very strong, loud, outspoken critic of communism in the mid and late 50s. Finally, we cannot end this decade of this period of time, I should say, before the Second Vatican Council, without talking about a very famous article that appeared in a Fordham University publication called Thought. The article was written by Monsignor John Tracy Ellis, who has been called the Dean of United States Catholic Historians, and whom we have had occasion to mention a number of times in this series. Monsignor Ellis wrote an article in which he decried, if you will, the lack of intellectualism in the Catholic body in the United States. Catholics do not seem particularly well educated, Monsignor Ellis wrote. They do not seem terribly interested in the intellectual life. This was a tremendous failing which John Tracy Ellis saw in the United States Catholic community. And he said even among Catholics who were scholars on college campuses, many of these people seemed not the least bit interested in pursuing any type of further academic career. They simply get their tenure and they're set for life. Therefore, claimed Monsignor Ellis, we are failing intellectually as a group in this country. Well, this article in the mid-50s, when Ellis wrote it, sent shockwaves through the United States Catholic community. There was a furor of protest. Many of these people thought, well, Monsignor Ellis is just sitting up here on this academic pedestal looking down, and what does he mean by saying that there's such a lack of intellectualism in the American Catholic community? We're as intellectual as anybody else. Other people agreed with him and saw, indeed, that there was a deficiency. One man who strongly disagreed with him was Cardinal O'Hara of Philadelphia. He said that Monsignor Ellis was simply talking about people who were, quotes, fog-bound. All you want to see, said Cardinal O'Hara, are fog-bound intellectuals buried in books and considered to be geniuses because no one knows what they are talking about. Well, that is not, said O'Hara, what we are looking for in the American Catholic community. So we had some very interesting times between 1945 and 1960. We had a great age of patriotism. We had a great age of strong Catholic faith, a strong devotional life among Catholics in the United States in the 1950s, a strong prayer life among Catholics in the United States in the 1950s. And we had grown to phenomenal numbers. We were a presence such as we never had been in the past. We were coming into the decade of the 1960s when things were going to change very substantially in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. In many ways, Catholics were very much prepared for the council. In other ways, they were not prepared for what the council was going to bring, for the richness of its tradition, but also the havoc that was caused by its misinterpretation. So, we had grown, we had developed, we were ready to move into the modern era, the era of the Second Vatican Council. We'd had a glorious historical legacy in this country, a legacy that attracted many people to it over the years. And in our final episode, we are going to look at so many of those marvelous converts to the Catholic faith from earliest days right up to 1960, those who knew it was the fullness of truth and we're determined to come into it. Thank you so much.